I have a good memory for hands. It is the first thing you learn. Tending the hurt, you cannot always see a face in a sick room dark. But you learn a body by the way it flinches, by where it guards itself, by the particular shape of a man trying not to make a sound. So when the steel came for him a second time, years later, and 100 leagues from that first cold wood, I did not think. My hands already knew the way. I had my palms pressed flat over the wound before the blade had finished falling, before the hall had finished screaming, before the king himself understood that the woman the court had spent a month calling unworthy was the only one in the room who had moved. Not again, I told him. Lo, the way you speak to the badly hurt, you do not get to bleed out twice on my watch. And Alaric, king of the whole grey north, the man who had not let a soul touch him in 7 years, looked up at me with my hands full of his blood and said the thing he had carried since a night he thought I had forgotten. But I am ahead of myself. It started in the dark, the way it always did with us. Let me go back to the first wound, the one no one saw. I was 19 the first time I saved his life, and I did not know I had done it until I was 26. That winter I lived at the edge of the hollow wood, in my grandmother's herb house, 3 days' walk from anything that called itself a town. I was an omega, the lowest a pack runs, the rank you are born into and do not climb out of, the wolves who are meant to keep their heads down and their hands useful. I had made my peace with it the way you make peace with weather. I kept the still room. I set bones for the village. I did not expect to be seen, and I was very rarely disappointed. The night I found him, there had been fighting in the high passes. We heard it the way you hear a storm 2 valleys over, a wrongness in the air. Wolves moving fast in the dark. I had gone out at moonset to cut the late witch hazel, which keeps best when the cold is hardest, and I nearly stepped on him. A man, in the snow, under a fallen spruce where he had dragged himself to die out of the wind. He was a wolf, I could smell that much. The iron and pine of a shifter, but he had no strength left to change, and he was bleeding from 3 places, and one of them was the kind that empties a man before dawn. I want to tell you I thought about it. I did not. You do not think about it, you kneel. I did not ask whose man he was, or which side of the fighting he had been on, or what it might cost an omega to be found with a great wounded warrior's blood to the elbow. I packed the deep wound with yarrow and bound it with the strips of my own underskirt, and I held the witch hazel cold against the swelling at his temple, and when he shook I lay down in the snow against his back so he would have something warmer than the ground to fail against. He was conscious, a little. Near the end of it, he never saw me. The moon was down, and my hood was up, and his eyes would not focus. But once, when I had my hands pressed over the worst of it to slow the bleeding, he found my wrist with his own bloodied fingers, and held it, not to stop me, only to hold it, the way a drowning man holds a rope. Stay, he said. Just that. The only word he spoke all night. I stayed until the bleeding slowed, and the grey came up in the east, and I knew he would live to see it. And then I did the thing an omega learns to do above all others, which is to disappear before anyone with rank wakes up and asks what she is doing there. I left him bread and the last of the witch hazel, and I went home. And I told no one, because no one would have believed me, and because believing me would have been the dangerous part. I never learned his name. I assumed he was some lord's huscarl, fallen in a border quarrel that was none of my concern. I was wrong about almost every part of that, but it took 7 years to find out how wrong. If you have ever done a great kindness in the dark for a stranger, and walked away certain you would never know what became of them, stay with me, because what became of this one is the whole of my story, and I promise you it is not the story you think. The man under the spruce was keeping a secret about that night, even from himself, and when I finally learned it, it changed everything I believed about who had done the bleeding and who had done the wounding. Follow along. It does not go where the title goes. 7 years passed. My grandmother died. The herb house grew too quiet. And then the king's writ came north. Alaric of the Grey North had ruled 7 years unmated, and pack law is pack law. An alpha past his prime with no Luna must hold a choosing. Every unmated woman of age in the territory presented at his court, so his wolf might find the bond. It had never reached as far as the hollow wood before. It reached us that spring. I was 26, a woman grown and then some. An Omega herb woman with cracked knuckles, and no silk to my name. And the writ did not care. It dragged the lowest of us to the capital beside the highest, all of us to stand in a row and be walked past. I went because refusal was a worse trouble than going. I expected to stand at the back, be overlooked, and walk home. I had a great deal of practice being overlooked. The Hall of the Grey North was the largest room I had ever stood in, and it was full of candidates. Noble daughters in furs worth more than my grandmother's house. All of them certain, all of them perfumed and ready. They put me at the end of the line, naturally, where the Omega belonged. I kept my eyes down, which is what you do. The king came down the row. I heard him before I saw him, the room going quiet in a wave. The way a wood goes quiet when something large is moving through it. A pause at each woman. A breath. The next. I counted them coming the way you count thunder, and I had my eyes on the flagstones when the pauses stopped in front of me. He did not breathe and move on. I looked up because the silence had gone wrong, stretched too long, and I found the king of the Grey North standing perfectly still, looking not at my face, but at my hands, where they were folded in front of me, cracked and stained and useless among all that silk. "Give me your hand," he said. It was not how you speak to a woman at a choosing. The whole hall heard the wrongness of it. I gave him my hand because a king had asked, and an Omega does not refuse, and he turned it over and looked at the palm. At the old burned scars from the still room and the calluses, and the particular map of a healer's hand, and something moved across his face that I had no name for then. Grief and disbelief, and a kind of terrible hope, all at once, in a man whose face the court swore had not changed expression in 7 years. "It was you," he said, very quietly, only to me. In the hollow wood, the night below the passes. His thumb found the inside of my wrist, the exact place a dying man had once held it. "I have been looking for these hands for 7 years. I never saw your face. I would have known your hands anywhere. I had spent my whole life learning not to be seen. And the most powerful man in the north had just told me, in front of his entire court, that he had spent 7 years seeing nothing else. They did not let me go home. I was given rooms in the upper keep, near the king's own library, which scandalized everyone, an Omega, lodged among the nobles, on the strength of a story about a night in the snow that half the court did not believe, and the other half found unbearable. I did not blame them. I hardly believed it myself. The king, having said the most naked thing in 7 years in front of 200 witnesses, then did not seem to know what to do with me at all. This is the part I did not understand for some weeks, and it is the truest thing about him, so I will say it plainly. Alaric was not a cold man. He was a grieving one. The court called him Iron, because iron was easier to fear than a man who had simply stopped letting anyone close enough to be lost. He had not held a choosing in 7 years because he did not want a Luna. He had held it now, only because his uncle and his council had worn him down. He had walked that line of candidates, fully intending to feel nothing, as he had trained himself to feel nothing, and then he had looked down and seen the hands that had kept him in the world, on a night he had been ready to leave it, and 7 years of careful nothing had cracked straight down the middle. So he kept his distance. He was courteous, and he was constant, and he was always, always 3 paces too far away, watching me across rooms with an expression like a man looking at a fire he is not allowed to warm himself at. It was the child who closed the distance neither of us would. His name was Bram. He was 6, an orphan of the pack, and he had decided, with the total conviction of the very young, that I belonged to him. He turned up at my door on the 3rd day with a frog in a jar and an injury he had invented to have an excuse, and he did not leave. He followed me to the still room. He fell asleep against my side in the library. He held my skirt in the corridors and told anyone who would listen that the healer was his now. I asked Edric, the king's second, a steady, dry, humoured man who had clearly decided long ago to like me and was waiting to see if it was safe, whose child Bram was. Edric went quiet in a way I was learning to read. He was the king's brother's boy, he said. Leif's son. Leif died in the passes, 7 years back. The same fighting. He looked at me a moment longer than the words needed. The king has raised him since. From a distance. He cannot, Edric stopped. Grief sits oddly on him. He loves the boy. He cannot get close to him. You will have noticed he cannot get close to anyone. I had noticed. I noticed everything. It is the one thing I have always been good at. And I noticed, after that, the way the king watched me with Bram. Not with envy, with something more like a man watching a door he thought had been bricked up for years and finding it standing open, and being afraid to walk through it in case it's shut. Not everyone found my arrival a tender thing. Lord Vasily found it intolerable, though he was far too clever to say so. He was the king's uncle, his regent in the lost years after the passes, a silver, gentle, much-loved old wolf who had held the north together while Alaric was young and bleeding, and who everyone, the king most of all, trusted absolutely. He came to me himself, kindly, within the week. He told me he was glad the king had found some comfort. He told me, gently, that I must understand the Omega could never be lunar, the court would fracture, the rival houses would rise, the boy Bram would suffer for it. He told me the truest kindness I could do the king I had once saved was to refuse him before his heart was in it past saving, and go home, and let Lady Astrid, a noble daughter of impeccable house, his own chosen match, take the place pack law and politics required. He said all of this with such warmth, such evident love for his nephew, that I very nearly believed he was right. That was the first move. I did not recognize it as a move. That was the point of it. Lady Astrid made the second, and hers was not gentle at all. At a court feast she rose and asked, in a voice pitched for the room, whether the king's judgment could be trusted at all if a single night's story from a peasant could turn him from his duty, whether the great Alpha of the North had gone soft in the head, mooning over a herb woman's hands, while real houses with real swords waited to be answered. It was cruel, and it was calculated, and it turned the hall cold around me, and I stood there in my borrowed finery, and felt every eye decide I did not belong. I did not answer her with heat. I have never had the luxury of heat. You are right that it was one night, I said into the quiet. You are wrong that it was small. I did not know who he was. I want that understood. I did not kneel in the snow for a king. I knelt for a dying stranger who would have been worth saving if he had been the lowest Omega in the north. I let that land. You ask whether his judgment can be trusted. I would ask a different thing. I would ask why a man who has been so badly hurt that he cannot let his own brother's son sit in his lap learnt to trust the one pair of hands that touched him when he could not see who they belonged to. That is not soft judgment, my lady. That is the only kind that cannot be flattered or bought. Ask yourself, who in this room is afraid of a judgment that cannot be bought? I did not know, when I said it, that I had walked straight onto the truth. I only knew the room had turned, and that Lord Vasily, at the high table, had stopped smiling for exactly one breath before he remembered to start again. I noticed it. I told you. I notice everything. I simply did not yet know what I had seen. I found out in the library, in the dark, which is where this king and I always found each other. I had not been able to sleep, and I had gone down for a candle and a book, and he was there, Alaric, alone, with a small iron box open before him and a single lamp, and he did not hide it when I came in. He had stopped hiding things from me somewhere in those weeks, which I think frightened him more than any wound. In the box were not letters. I had half expected letters. In the box was a length of cloth, old, brown-stained, cut from a woman's underskirt 7 years gone, and a dried sprig of witch hazel, and a single page in a hard hand. "I kept what you left me," he said. "I did not know your name to thank you. I told myself I kept it to find you. I think I kept it because it was the only proof that someone had chosen to keep me alive without knowing what I was worth to anyone." He looked at the cloth, not at me. "I have to tell you something about that night, and once I do you cannot unknow it, and it will put you in more danger than the snow ever did. I have told no living soul in 7 years. I am telling you because I am done lying in the dark to the one person who ever sat with me in it." And then he told me the thing the title of my own story does not know. He had not been wounded by raiders in the passes. There had been no border quarrel. He had been 17, newly alpha, riding to put down a rising with his younger brother Leif at his side, and his uncle's men at his back. And his uncle's men had turned. The ambush was Vasily's. The whole of it. The kindly regent had arranged to have the boy king and his brother killed in the high snow, and the blame laid on raiders, so that he might rule the north in truth and not just in name. Leif had died there. Alaric had been left for dead. 3 wounds, the cold, the dark, and he had crawled under a spruce to die. And an Omega he never saw had crawled in after him and held his wrist and told him to stay. He had lived. And he had come down out of the passes alone, with no proof and no witness but his own certainty, into a court that adored his uncle, and he had understood that if he spoke he would not be believed, and if he was not believed he would not survive a second attempt. So he said raiders. He let Vasily keep the regency. He grew up fast and hard and alone, trusting no one, holding everyone 3 paces off, because the man who had tried to murder him sat smiling at his right hand and called him son. "He does not know you saw nothing," Alaric said. "He knows only that there was a woman in the wood that night. He has known for years that someone pulled me out. And he has spent those years quietly making certain no such woman ever surfaced to be asked what she saw. And now I have stood up in my own hall and announced to the whole North that the woman exists, that she is here, and that I would know her hands anywhere." His voice was very level, which is how I knew how frightened he was. "I have painted a mark on you, Orla. I am more sorry for that than for anything I have done in 7 years. I sat with that. I sat with the kindly old man who had warned me away so warmly, and the gentle words about sparing the king, and the one breath he had forgotten to keep smiling through, and I felt the whole shape of it click into place like a set bone. Something in me changed in that room, and it did not change back. Up to that night, I had been the woman who disappears before dawn, who does the kindness in the dark and walks away before the rank wakes. I had built a whole life out of leaving before I could be made to pay for being seen. I was done leaving. "He came to me," I said. My voice had gone flat and certain, a voice I did not know I owned. "Your uncle. Day before last. All warmth. Told me to refuse you and go home, for your sake, for the boy's sake. I met the king's eyes. He was not protecting you from a broken heart. He was getting the witness to remove herself before anyone thought to ask her what she remembered. He has been trying to walk me back into the dark on my own feet. Alaric had gone very still. Then we will not give him the dark, I said. I spent 7 years thinking I saved a stranger. I did not. I saved the only man in the north who can put a name to what happened in those passes, and you have spent 7 years thinking you survived it alone. You did not. You will not do this part alone either. I am not very good at being protected. Ask the snow. His uncle did not wait to be exposed. Clever men never do. Vasily moved at the autumn rite, the night the king renews his oath to the pack before the whole court. The one night the alpha kneels, unarmed and unguarded. In the old form, his throat bared to the moon while his people witness. It is the most sacred and the most defenseless a king is ever permitted to be. Vasily had chosen it 7 years ago for the brother. He chose it again. I want to tell this plainly, because it is where the warmth goes out of the story and the cold comes in. The blade was meant to look like a challenger's. Astrid's house had a grievance, a young hothead with a sword and a reason. All of it arranged. All of it deniable. He came out of the witnesses while the king knelt with his throat bared and his eyes on the moon. And the hall was slow to understand, the way halls are, and I was not slow, because I had spent my whole life watching for the wound before it lands. I was already moving when the steel fell. I got my hands over Alaric's throat and shoulder, between the king and the blade, and the edge opened the back of my hands and my forearm instead of his neck. A bright line, a wash of red, the particular cold shock I had felt once before with my palms full of a stranger's blood. But it did not reach him. Because the moment I moved, his wolf moved, and Edric moved, and the hothead with the borrowed grievance found himself with an Omega's bleeding hands in the way of his blade, and an Alpha rising under him like the north itself standing up. Not again, I told Alaric. Lo, my hands pressed flat to hold the bleeding, his and mine confused together. You do not get to bleed out twice on my watch. And the king looked up at me with my blood on his collar. And then he stood. And he did the thing he had been unable to do for 7 years. He turned to the whole assembled court, on the most sacred night of the pack, with the proof of an assassination still wet on the floor, and he did not say raiders. 7 years ago in the high passes, Alaric said, and his voice carried to the back of the hall and beyond it, my brother Leif did not die fighting raiders. He was murdered. I was left for dead beside him. The men who turned on us that night wore my own colours, sent by the man who has called himself my protector, ever since. He turned, and the whole court turned with him, to the high table, to the kindly silver wolf, who had at last, finally, stopped smiling. I had no witness, and no proof, and so I held my tongue and let you keep your regency, uncle, and I have hated myself for 7 years for the cowardice of it. I have a witness now. She has pulled me out of your dark twice. You should not have warned her away so gently. She notices everything, and she has spent a month watching you forget when to smile. It was Vasily's own panic that finished him. Faced with the witness alive and the king unkilled, and the court's adoration curdling in real time, he reached, for a guard, for a blade, for the boy Bram, who had been brought to the right as the king's heir, and who Vasily lunged toward as the last card a cornered man plays. He did not reach the child. I did. I had Bram behind me and Vasily's wrist in both my ruined hands before I had decided to move, the same hands that had set 100 bones, and I held on the way a drowning man once held my wrist in the snow. And I did not let go until Edric's men took him from me. You will notice I keep ending up between this family and the thing that wants to end it. I have thought about that a great deal since. I think it is only that I have never in my life learned how to walk away from a wound when my hands already know the way. It was over by morning. They always are, the things that take 7 years to arrive. 6 months later, the high passes were green again, and I went up to see them, because I had never seen the place I saved him except in the dark. I am Luna of the Grey North now, which I am still not entirely reconciled to. The court came around the way courts do, which is to say slowly, and then all at once, the moment it became clear which way the wind held. The houses that schemed for Lady Astrid found other ambitions. Astrid herself was sent south to a minor holding, more fortunate than she deserved, and less than she believes. And Vasily stood his trial before the whole pack he had betrayed, was stripped of every honour he had stolen, and was sent to the cold north to live out his years as exactly what he had tried to make me, a witness no one will ever ask anything of again. Bram sleeps in a room that connects to ours now, though he turns up in ours most nights anyway. Frog or no frog, Alaric holds him without flinching these days. It took practice. I have watched a man relearn how to put his arms around something he is afraid of losing, one careful evening at a time. And I will tell you there is no battle in the north I would not rather have lost than miss the watching of it. And the king still cannot sleep, some nights, on the dark of the year. On those nights I find him in the library with the small iron box, the brown cloth and the dried witch hazel, the only proof that someone once chose to keep him in the world. He keeps it still. I have told him he may throw it out now. I am here. The proof is redundant. He says he is keeping it for the boy, so that one day Bram will know exactly how thin the thread was that he hangs from, and how it held. A letter came north last week from the Hollow Wood, from the village I left, where they had heard, the way the whole world eventually hears, that the Omega herb woman who used to disappear before dawn was Luna of the Grey North now. They wanted to know if it was true. They wanted to know how a woman who spent her whole life making sure no one saw her had ended up crowned in front of the entire North. I have thought about how to answer. I think I will tell them the truth, which is the only thing I have ever been good for. I told them I cleaned a stranger's wounds in the dark and walked away certain it would cost me nothing, and mean nothing, and that I was wrong on both counts, and that being wrong was the best thing that ever happened to me. And then I will tell them the part my old self would never have believed, that the kindness you do in the dark, certain no one will ever know, is the one the world remembers longest. He never saw my face that night. He never stopped seeing my hands. I spent 26 years sure that the safe thing was to leave before the light came up. It turns out the brave thing, the harder thing, the thing worth all the rest, was to stay until morning and let him finally see who had been there the whole time. So tell me, that night in the snow, when he caught my wrist and said the one word he had strength for, do you think his wolf already knew it was the woman he would spend 7 years looking for? Or do you think even he could not have guessed the hands that saved him would walk back into his hall and save him twice more? I lived it, and I still cannot decide. Tell me your theory below. And if you want to know what waits for Vasily in the cold north, and whether Bram ever forgives the family for how thin that thread was, comment the witch hazel, and I will know to tell it. Stay with me, the boy's story is already being written, and you will want it before everyone else does. Where are you listening from tonight?